Welcome to today's program, brought to you by the Center for Global Justice. Happy to have you with us today. I'm Cliff Durand. I'll be your host for today. The Center for Global Justice, El Centro para la Justicia Global, is located in San Miguel de Allende, Mexico. Due to COVID, we have not been able to have our usual money-generating programs for a couple of years, actually, and so we ask you to make donations as you are able to. You can donate by going to our website, globaljusticecenter.org. Today, we are happy to have with us two representatives of the Palestinian embassy in Mexico City, as well as Pedro Gellert, who is head of the Mexican Palestinian Solidarity Organization. From the embassy, we have Fakhry Taha and Miguel Angel Barragan. So we'll turn the floor over to them, and afterwards we'll take your questions and comments.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Thanks for the invitation. And, Peter, invited us, and it was an opportunity. I was like on the board because I wanted to hear his New York accent in English. I tried to get English out of him, but he likes gray spaces where we can meet. In Spanish, Mexico is a place where we can meet for him. So yeah, thank you very much. Good afternoon. First of all, I want to convey the gratitude of His Excellency Mohammed Sadat, Ambassador of Palestine, for your kind invitation to the event, and his apologies for not having been able to come today. I also extend my personal gratitude for inviting us and giving us the chance to speak about our cause and our struggle for independence. As many of you know, colonialism and expansionism are at the core of Israeli policy since the beginning, and to that purpose, Israel was founded on the basis of massacres and ethnic cleansing, because its aim is to deny the Palestinian identity and to annex the totality of the Palestinian territory. During the Nakba, back in 1947 and 1948, Zionist gangs carried out more than 70 massacres, destroyed 531 towns and villages, and killed more than 15,000 Palestinians. They also displaced more than 850,000 Palestinians. Since then, more than 70 years ago, Israel has violated the rights of Palestinian people.
Can you speak louder?
Yeah, okay. Israel has violated the rights of the Palestinian people every single day. These violations include the periodic military aggressions against the people of Gaza Strip, the massacres in both Gaza and West Bank, and the inhuman blockade against Gaza Strip, which has lasted more than 16 years until now. The expansion of Israeli colonial settlements in the West Bank, evictions and demolitions of Palestinian homes, harassment of the settlers against the Palestinians, unlawful detentions, extrajudicial executions, and much more. All these abuses are possible due to the Israeli occupation of the land, which has denied us our right to self-determination for decades. At the United Nations, both the General Assembly and Security Council have approved dozens of resolutions to address the multiple violations of our rights, including the right of self-determination, the right to life, the right of the refugees to return to their homes. Unfortunately, Israel has not respected any of these resolutions and instead continues to intensify the colonization of our land, including the Judaization of East Jerusalem. Just recently, the Israeli government decided to legalize more colonial outposts and built 10,000 units already existing in the West Bank, a decision that has been criticized even by its closest allies. This Israeli government, as you know, is far right extremist, even by Israel's standards. Not only it has increased the settlement activity, but also it has intensified the provocation at our holy sites like Al-Aqsa Mosque, and it has carried out several raids on the West Bank, which have resulted in massacres like the most recent one in Jenin. Israeli occupation forces has killed more than one Palestinian each day since the beginning of 2023. It has also hardened the situation of Palestinian prisoners who are about to start a strike of protest against the violation of the most basic human rights. Last year, the United Nations General Assembly approved a resolution to request the International Court of Justice to issue an advisory opinion on the implication of the continuous Israeli violations of the Palestinian people's right to self-determination. In response, Israel adopted retaliatory measures such as inter alia seizing the collected taxes that correspond to the Palestinian government, paralyzing the construction of Palestinian houses in Area C of the West Bank, revoking exit card from Palestinian authorities, and increasing harassment against NGOs in the occupied territory. So as you can see, Israel acts like a pariah state, conducting itself as a state above the law, violating multiple instruments of the international law and international humanitarian law, such as the UN Charter and the Fourth Geneva Convention, among others. And the international community has failed to hold Israel accountable for its grave violations. Israel's actions are a menace, not only for the Palestinian people, but for the whole international system, because they set dangerous precedents for disregard of international law. We, the Palestinians, are the first line of defense for the principle of the UN Charter, and that is why it is important for all people who love peace to support our struggle. To address the widespread confusion about the situation in Palestine, we must say this again and again. The core issue of the conflict is the Israeli occupation of the Palestinian territory. Israel must put in it because they set dangerous precedents of disregard for international law. We, the Palestinians, are the first line of defense of the principles of the UN Charter, and that is why it is so important for all people who love peace to support our struggle. To address the widespread confusion about the situation in Palestine, we must say that this again and again, the core issue of the conflict is the Israeli occupation of the Palestinian territory. Israel must put an end to its occupation of our land and respect our right to establish our independent, free and sovereign state within the borders of 1967 and with the East Jerusalem as its capital. The international community must apply pressure on Israel for it to comply with the international law and respect the right of self-determination. This includes rejecting dealings with a government that openly and explicitly expresses its intention to breach international law and commit international crimes. Second, ensuring accountability through positive engagement with the mechanisms of international justice. For protecting the Palestinian people by the activation of mechanisms and means made available by the international community under the international law. For protecting and helping realize the right of Palestinian people to self-determination by taking steps to officially recognize the state of Palestine. We need these and every other action that puts pressure on Israel, the occupying power, for it to end its occupation, so that we can achieve justice and peace in the region and guarantee the future of generations to come. And
Okay, you will not have a problem with my voice. I prefer a microphone, but okay. I would like to discuss three questions that are very current. The internal situation in Israel, the effect of this situation on Israel's allies, particularly the United States, but also Western Europe, and relations with the Jewish communities abroad, mainly the United States, which of course is tied to the question of US policy. What we have in Israel is now the most right-wing government in the history of that country. We are light years away from the founder of Israel, David Ben-Gurion, who right before the establishment of the state of Israel said that the Jewish people have two homelands, Palestine and the Soviet Union. That ship has sailed. Right now, the fight in Israel and the change in the situation is basically on three levels. First, the big struggle, and today is been declared a day of national struggle. It's very possible that it will be the largest demonstration in the history of that country today. The main question and the thing that has been galvanizing the most debate and the most action in the street is the question of the independence of the judicial branch. The proposal of the new right-wing government is that the basic laws are not subject to judicial review, that the parliament, which is in the hands of the right wing, can override Supreme Court decisions, and that the governing coalition has the right to appoint judges. The second issue, which particularly among young people has sparked considerable outrage, is the question of the religious domination over the secular majority. On a lot of these issues, even Netanyahu, who is light years away from being progressive, has said it's ridiculous. The right-wing ministers, the religious right-wing ministers, wanted to prohibit the use to eliminate electricity on the Sabbath, which obviously the secular majority is not taking well, or an industry is not taking well, and anyone who has to do any activity is not taking well. But it's also on the question of education, public education, LGBT rights, women's rights, and a whole bunch of other issues. But the most serious question, of course, is the occupation. At stake is not just the myriad forms of oppression that the Palestinian people, particularly in the West Bank, have been experiencing over decades, but what is at stake now is the threat of wholesale expulsion. I'll explain in a minute. Here in Netanyahu's words, textually, the Jewish people have an exclusive and unquestionable right to all areas of the land of Israel. The government will promote and develop settlement in all parts of the land of Israel, in the Galilee, the Negev, the Golan, Judea and Samaria, which are the Zionist terms for the occupied West Bank. What does this mean concretely in these days? I'm talking about literally these days. The transfer of authority over the civil administration of Palestine, Palestinian life in the West Bank, and over the coordinator of government activities in the territory, Defense Minister Yoav Gallant from Likud, who's right-wing already, to Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich of the ultra-nationalist religious Zionist party. That is, you're passing all decisions relating to Palestinian life in the occupied territory to the most openly racist, reactionary, religious fanatic. The US government says openly this is tantamount to de jure annexation. Netanyahu occasionally says, going too far on this, but the fact is that the right-wing religious Zionist ministers have the upper hand. So there is a battle going on between the extreme right Zionists and religious parties and center-right parties, backed by civil society and a weak left-wing opposition. At least half of Israeli society sees this as a life and death issue for so-called Israeli democracy. It is an existential question that raises the question of what type of state they want in Israel. Netanyahu obviously is more attuned to preserving the facade of a democratic government and international legitimacy, and the right-wing Zionist religious parties couldn't care less about this. So what we're seeing is an increase in settlement building in violation of international law, the destruction of villages. In January, they announced the imminent destruction of 12 villages, Palestinian villages in the West Bank. The legalization of new outposts and settlements in the West Bank, and advanced plans for some 10,000 new settlement homes, the largest ever package to be greenlit in one sitting. More openly racist policies. In summary, settlement construction, home demolitions, raids on city and villages, and extrajudicial killings of Palestinians. As I said, attention has mainly focused on the two most right-wing members, National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir and Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich, both of whom received key government positions with jurisdiction in the occupied territories. And they are openly committed to dismantling the Palestinian Authority as part of their annexation ambition, and they openly talk of the expulsion of the Palestinian population. But of course, there's one big problem: the existence of the Palestinian people. The Israeli policy is to make their lives a living hell, to impose a military regime that denies them the most basic civil and human rights, hoping that either demoralization or that they leave for other places, that is, keep them under control, and an ethnic cleansing. But this reality cannot be maintained in the long term. This reality, which includes hundreds of deaths, including children, house demolitions, checkpoints, and the prohibition of freedom of movement, the continual expropriation of Palestinian land, and poor to non-existent health services and infrastructure, obviously creates an explosive situation on the ground in terms of the most basic rights of the Palestinian people and the frustration of living year after year, decade after decade in this type of situation with nothing and no hope in sight. But the Palestinian people remain. 2.9 million Palestinians live just in the West Bank, and 1.9 million, almost 2 million Palestinians live within the state of Israel, that is, Palestinian citizens of the state of Israel. So the question, of course, is what is the policy of Israel? To maintain permanent occupation over the majority of the population, that is, without rights of citizenship, without the most basic civil rights, and what will happen with this? Okay, the question of questions is, of course, whether the United States will move beyond verbal denunciation, which they've been more or less doing lately. Palestine clearly is not a priority for U.S. foreign policy, or for U.S. policy in general. The U.S. administration, the Biden administration, I think has three main policy objectives. One, preventing Trump and Trumpism from returning into office. Secondly, Ukraine. And third, counteracting China. At the same time, Washington wants to prevent a collapse of the Palestinian Authority and consolidate the Abraham Accords in the Middle East. But there are two obstacles to these Abraham Accords. First, in all of the countries that have recently signed peace treaties with Israel or extended diplomatic recognition, all of them, between 2/3 and 85% of the local population rejects these accords and rejects the idea of normalization with Israel as long as the occupation continues. What's very interesting, I saw some interesting public opinion polls on the question of Palestine in the Arab world. Very few, like 7-8% population in the Arab countries felt this was a religious conflict. They all centered the criticism of their government's policies on the question of Israeli occupation and racist treatment of the Palestinian population. And of course, the other obstacle to the Abraham Accords is that the new government and Netanyahu's policies threaten a consolidation and extension of these accords. Okay, what is the situation currently within Israel? You have a mass movement, probably unprecedented in the history of the state, that on a weekly basis is able to pull out 100,000 people, and sometimes more in cities throughout Israel. This is a new phenomenon. The protests have maintained their strength. Those of us, I don't know how many people, I imagine many people here over the different parts of their lives have been active in social struggles, and we know that, struggles come and then they go down, and it's difficult to maintain a dynamic of every single week pulling out hundreds of thousands of people. This has been the case. Not only has it been the case, they've been increasing in size. And they have involved sectors not traditionally involved in protest demonstrations, including the economic elite, military officials, people who view the Netanyahu and the religious Zionist parties as a threat to the type of life and type of government and type of country they want, and to stability in Israel, Palestine, and the Middle East as a whole. So we have a divided society in Israel. There is a broad fear that Israel would, I'm going to get to this question of democracy, will cease being a democracy, will be like Hungary, Turkey, Poland, even in the US in terms of Trumpism. In fact, in Hungary, Turkey, and Poland, there have been similar judicial reforms, that is, eliminating the autonomy of the judicial branch. So the opposition includes leaders from within the Zionist camp, legal authorities, finance and business leaders, security officials who are much more realistic and have a less messianic biblical view that they can do whatever they want because God is with them. Okay, now what is the Achilles heel of the protest movement? The occupation of the Palestinian question. Okay, they say Israeli democracy is under attack and is being threatened, but the question is democracy for whom? Israel is a democracy for its Jewish citizens, and the basic law of the nation is very, very clear on that the Jews have an exclusive right to self-determination in Israel and no one else. That the Israeli state does not define, Netanyahu had a polemic against some moderately left-wing Israeli actress on the question of whether Israel is the state of its citizens. And he said, no, Israel is the state of the Jewish people. Now, this is not a semantical question. For example, in Mexico, everyone born in Mexico is Mexican automatically and has the same rights and obligations. Mexico is defined as the state of the Mexican people. Israel is not defined as the state of the Israeli citizens. It is defined as the state of the Jewish people. But 20% of the citizens of Israel are not Jewish. That is built into the law. I'm not talking about racist attitudes that people might have and racist practices and things. I'm talking about built into the very definition of the state of Israel is the conception that it is a state of some of its citizens. That is, it is a state built and conceived on an ethnic basis. Some people say it's a theocratic state, increasingly more so, but more than that, it is an ethnocracy, that is a state based on not its citizens as a whole, but on an ethnic criteria. So there's been a tendency in the demonstrations not to raise the issue of the occupation, and people who have gone with Palestinian flags to the demonstrations have been attacked or criticized and things like that. And in the beginning, the Arab population did not participate in these demonstrations. In the last day or two, literally, since yesterday or Saturday, this has begun to change. There was an open letter from 200 Arab leaders calling on the Palestinian, the Arab population of the state of Israel to participate, saying that any move to the right, and any deterioration of the situation will be hardest felt by the population, Palestinian population of Israel. So they're calling on people to participate in these demonstrations. Okay, I have mixed views on this question. Obviously, there can be no democratic future for Israel without a democratic resolution to the Palestinian question. That is basic. Israel's not the only country in that category. I don't think there can be a democratic future in Mexico without incorporating, as the Zapatistas would say, never more Mexico without us. There can be no democratic future in the United States. It's not just a question of racism. But in Israel, that is much, much more of a pressing issue because from the Mediterranean to the Jordan, Palestinians at this point are about 50% of the population of historic Palestine. And we're not talking about a majority oppressing the small minority. We're talking about 50% that is, from the word go, not considered to be part of the state. Okay, on the other hand, I mean, the criticism of the demonstrations for not raising, keeping quiet about the question of the occupation is a completely justified criticism, but also there is the question of, how do people radicalize? I was active in the anti-Vietnam War movement in the United States. I imagine several people here as well. And many people said, no, this anti-war movement isn't worth it. It's garbage. It's people who think that Vietnam is just a mistake, who don't understand imperialism. There were people who wanted to have a movement that explicitly called for victory for the Vietnamese and carried NLF flags and stuff. And many of us in the movement said, no, this movement is objectively anti-imperialist. It's fighting the imperialist government, and people will change in struggle. When people in struggle, that's how they change, and that's how they start thinking about new things, not being given a lecture or something. But okay, this is but it is a real major problem with the protests in Israel. Okay, what is the reaction of the Western world to this? Basically, the US and the European, both public opinion and governments, with the exception of Hungary and Poland, the most right-wing governments, are completely appalled about this and feel that, beyond a doubt, the new right-wing government threatens a two-state solution and threatens to inflame the entire Middle East. Now, in this, the position of the Jewish community in the United States, which is about 6 million strong and heavily involved in the Democratic Party and in other business sectors, cultural sectors, is quite important. Netanyahu is correctly viewed as the Trump of Israel. And in the United States, about 80% of the Jewish population rejects Trump. And it's quite easy to draw this line. This, of course, is much worse in the case of Israel than Trump, because in Israel, this is combined with religious fanatics in power. In the United States, only about 10% of the Jewish population in the United States is Orthodox. If you eliminate this population from opinion polls, on everything else, the American Jewish population is far to the left of not only American population as a whole, but the Israeli government's policies. For example, and the question of the elections is that about 80% of American Jews voted against Trump. After African Americans, it is the group of population that was most against Trump, and the GOP in general. So in the United States, American Jews, particularly young American Jews, when they see this nonsense coming from Trump, this nonsense coming from the Christian nationalists and the far right and the QAnon and the conspiracy theory crowd, people go, what the fuck is this? And it's very easy that this is extended to Israel as well. Okay, for example, I saw some very interesting opinion polls of young American Jews. 15% reject the existence of Israel as a state. 40% think that Israel is racist. And 60 to 65% think that Israel is not seeking peace. This is a real change from 20 or 30 or 40 years ago. We're talking about young people, now. But I think there is a general feeling that the official Jewish establishment is reeling, is very much on the defensive, and has a very hard time justifying the Israeli policies. The result of this has been that the Netanyahu and company are seeking a realignment in Israeli support in the United States, away from the Jewish community and toward the Christian fundamentalism. And they are the most fanatical Zionists in America. They're also the most anti-Semitic sector of American society, but they are beyond a doubt the most fanatical supporters of Israel. Not only because Israel has a right-wing government, and not only because this right-wing government shares their cultural demands and cultural outlooks, there's also a religious component. And most of the Christian nationalists have the theory that Jesus Christ cannot return until the Jews have been established in Zion. So it's much, much farther to the right and more intransigent than even the pro-Israel sentiment in the American Jewish community. This Christian fundamentalist support for Israel is in the most reactionary sector of US society. Okay, all of this poses challenges for those of us who are friends of Palestine. First of all, the public opinion on an international level in the United States, in the Democratic Party, is increasingly questioning Israel. This is a very important opportunity. Secondly, that for anyone and everyone who's fighting for a better world, regardless of where your particular front of struggle is, in trade unions, in women's issues, LGBTQ, international questions, Palestine is a key component part of this struggle. And I will end with 2 points. First, a little commercial. If anyone here is of Jewish background and is Mexican citizen, naturalized or otherwise, we're circulating a letter to the Foreign Relations Ministry asking for a meeting, asking for a discussion, raising the issue of this definition of anti-Semitism that the International Holocaust Remembrance Council, I think it's called, is pushing, that basically says that criticism of the right of Israel to exist is ipso facto anti-Semitic. And there's another declaration, Jerusalem Declaration by Israeli academics saying this is not the case. So in any event, we're circulating a thing for Jewish Mexicans to sign to bring pressure on the Mexican government. And that's the final issue. So if anyone can sign that, if they're a Mexican citizen, give me your data. And finally, I just want to end with the position of our government that has been much, much more progressive and much better than previous Mexican governments. There was recently a joint declaration of Mexico, Brazil, Argentina, and there's another one, Mexico, Brazil, Argentina, Chile, okay, in support of Palestinians against Israeli policy. And Mexican vote in the United States, Mexican interventions have been against further settlement, attacking Israel for not seeking peace. There's been a progressive change, and we'll see what happens also with the next government. I should mention the fact that the current front runner for Morena, Claudia Sheinbaum, has publicly spoken up in solidarity with Palestine. And that, of course, would be a new and more promising situation. But that the Mexican government on the whole has taken a good position, but that we have to keep the pressure on because there are, of course, people in the Mexican government who want politics as usual. So in general, I would say that we're in a new situation in Israeli politics, a new situation inside the Jewish community, and a new situation internationally with many challenges and many threats to the very possibility of a peaceful resolution to the conflict, but also many opportunities to show solidarity, real solidarity and effective solidarity with the Palestinian people.
Well, I want to thank our speakers for their very provocative presentation, and we'll open the floor for questions and comments. Who would like to speak? Come up front here.
Okay, yeah, I have a couple of comments. So firstly, thank you both for that. I'll restrict my comments to, I guess we're talking about the occupied territories, the land that the Israelis stole from 1967 onward, not that which they stole previous to that, which the world community unfortunately let them get away with. It's very gratifying to see that there are more and more people, both within Israel and out, and especially in the United States, and as you mentioned, young American people from Jewish background, being more and more critical of Israeli policy. I don't think we should be naive. This isn't going. That's not going to do it. That kind of incremental increase in awareness. The Israeli population is overwhelmingly in favor of this Zionist land theft. Many of them would rather it would be done with less brutality, but altogether they're okay with it. In the United States, half the population was fanatically into Trump. In Israel, it's much more than half the population who are fanatically into the continuation of holding on to Palestinian land. So I don't think it's going to work. It should be welcomed, and we should keep working to educate people. But the only thing that I see as having a real chance in creating a solution is if the Israelis actually annex the West Bank, rather, so it will then become, because of population, it will soon then become actual apartheid instead of the de facto apartheid that there has been. Once there's actual apartheid, so that they can't pretend otherwise, then there's a real chance for the world community to rise up and go against the US and place massive sanctions on Israel, and that could have some enough force to create a solution. It would probably be before there's a solution, though, there would probably precipitate a civil war in Israel, very possibly. But anyway, so I don't think we should be naive about what there is to the possibilities of success. So the other comment that I just wanted to make is, in terms of educating people, yes, there's all the information from accredited sources across disciplines, law, human rights, media, academia, that it doesn't take much of a search to realize that the vast majority of them make it clear, usually in polite language, that this is Israel's fault. But most young Americans, and I think that's the demographic that we need to focus on, they are not going to do that kind of research. So one point that I think is very useful is to ask the question, throughout my life, the rhetoric has been that Israel is temporarily holding on to Palestinian land for safety as a militarized buffer zone to protect the so-called vulnerable Jewish Israelis from the psychopathic, murderous Palestinians who just want to kill all the Jews. No, they don't want their land back. And even though almost all of the violence has been done by the Israelis towards Palestinians, not the other way around. So it's a temporary thing. And though now Netanyahu and others are kind of changing that and essentially admitting, okay, you guys were right, we are thieves after all, though again, he doesn't use those words, but still the rhetoric has been, it's temporary for safety. And most Zionists, I think, still, especially the non-religious ones, go for that argument. So I would counter that with, to ask them, if it's for safety, then why have successive Israeli governments not only allowed, but ideologically massively encourage and financially massively subsidize those so-called Jewish Israelis to go and live in that area that they're saying is emanating so much murderous danger towards them that it needs to be held by the Israeli military. It's a rather strange kind of militarized buffer zone to send your vulnerable citizens to go and live there. How does that protect them? And while I'm at it, why are they taking the water and other resources from that land? Is that also for safety? So none of it makes sense. And I think if you ask that kind of question to a young American person, the penny might drop and they might suddenly realize, yes, that doesn't make sense. In fact, the only thing that makes sense of this is if the Israelis are brutal, criminal, thieving colonialists. It's the only thing that fits with what we see. So those are my comments. Thank you very much.
Yeah, so yeah, when it comes, it's good, I have three hands now. When it comes to naivety, we are not naive about what's happened. And since not even 1948, but before, we have a long history of not trusting of what's happening right now. Nonetheless, the South African precedent is very important for us. Now, what creates an apartheid regime? Why some regimes are apartheid regimes and why some are not? In the 2001 Durban Conference of the Anti-Racism, a few weeks before 9/11, actually, all nations were in this international conference under the United Nations. And Australia came up and they said, there is a condemnation against colonial laws. And our colonial laws are the laws that built the country. There are the laws that regularize civil marriage and they regularize building cities and so on and so forth. And Australians and Canadians have a lot of affinity with the state of Israel. Australians entered Palestine in the First World War, and they also sent some troops to fight Vichy government, Vichy Syria in World War II. So one of the things that I have studied about the history of the cause is that Australians and Canadians really support Israel always in the United Nations. But Australia and Canada are not apartheid regimes. There's some institutional racism, yes, and there are a lot of problems, and there's a history, colonial history. They're not apartheid regimes. What they do have in Israel doesn't have. It would be space. And this is where the problem comes from the UK historically. To construct a nation when there is no space, that's going to cause problems for the future. In South Africa, there was space, but here's the second element. There are too much of the native population. And just like Peter said, there's too much Palestinians. And the Israeli government, they cannot understand that. They want to wish the problem away, but we're here. And this is the problem. So yeah, we are, I was going to say we are on the eve of apartheid. I think there was elements of apartheid always, but now it's going to be the jure, not only the fact. And just like I said, we're not naive about that. It's a big problem that, this international system that is failing on so many levels it started failing us back in the 90s. And now it's failing everybody. There's a crisis of democracy everywhere, and there's a neoliberal crisis everywhere. And it started with us. It started when the negotiations collapsed, because the country that they wanted to give us is the same country Trump wanted to give us, which one of the Israeli ambassadors in South Africa said that map, the map of the solution, the Trump solution, the Jared Kushner solution, is an apartheid. And it's not only an apartheid, there's a superposition of apartheid and occupation. It's kind of funny. In the United States, there are some Civil War reenactment camps. If you want to reenact colonialism, 19th century colonialism, 18th century colonialism, go to the West Bank. That's it.
No,
Just a question.
come up here.
Okay. The question is, observation is, back in the 90s, there was a Oslo agreement, and Arafat and Rabin entered into an agreement which would have settled many of these questions. And shortly after that, Rabin was assassinated by a fundamentalist Jew extremist. And shortly after that, Netanyahu came to power. And Netanyahu is a brilliant man. He's also very corrupt. And he could flip people like Trump by just clicking his fingers. And that's exactly what he did, flipping Trump. And my hope is that as bad as this situation is, that somehow we were able to construct an agreement, a peace treaty between Arafat and Rabin, that somehow we have to go back to that, where things can be worked out in Israel. Yeah, all gone, yeah. Yeah. I hope not, but it looks that way. And that's very sad. It's very sad.
Thank you very much. In 2004, in the ICJ advisory opinion, when Israel rejected such judicial move, they wrote in their defense that the International Court of Justice cannot rule upon an issue that is negotiated bilaterally between two states, including the assigning of borders of a state. By the way, my boss always told me, never forget that the only UN nation member is that doesn't have borders with Israel. The ICJ rejected that. So Israelis, the Israeli government, not as Israeli, have been always hiding behind bilateralism up until the Abraham Accord. Never make peace with all of them, make peace with one by one, since Egypt, 1978. And on the other side of the aisle, there was Palestine, and there was the Palestinian government, and there was the Arab Initiative that insisted on a multilateral peace. And not only a multilateral peace between nations of the Middle East, but multilateral in general, because to create a sustainable situation, it should be an international situation. One of the reasons where I work is that we are still beholden into internationalist multilateralism from the 20th century, which came under a lot of attack, unfortunately, in the past few years, whether from the angle of the Palestinian cause or many other causes, unfortunately. Now we have a much weaker international system. We have much weaker internationalism. I know Peter saw that change. You know, there are a lot of articles in Jacobin magazine saying that U.S. internationalism now is not enough. Left, even on the burn side, not enough. It's the mechanisms to be salvaged in the 20th century that we built and became under attack. So yeah, bilateralism is a ruse, and the Israeli government has always been hiding behind it. And I mean, it's just like saying, well, domestic abuse is bilateral. We cannot interfere in this house.
Yeah, I agree completely that the majority of the Israeli population has been sold the Zionist narrative and views the state as their state and has a racist attitude toward Palestinians, simply that these things can change. I don't think that any sort of annexation, I reject the idea of the worse the better. That is, if there is an annexation of the West Bank, and that'll, you know, expose the brutality of Israeli rule, which I think has been quite exposed already. I think the two things. First, the argument that's used in Israel and in Jewish communities that Israel is a safety net. We have to respond to that, that of all of the countries in the world, the countries where Jews are most insecure is precisely Israel, and precisely because of Israel's policies. That Zionism on that level has been a failure. But I think that we can also combine two types of slogans. I think one is, I think I agreed with in 1969 when Yasser Arafat said that the best solution would be one single state, but that the degree of polarization between the two peoples is such that that's not in the cards at the moment. So two states. Okay. I think that can be combined with the idea of a programmatic long-term perspective for a single democratic state in historic Palestine for both peoples as the only democratic permanent solution to the question. But I think that has to be combined with solutions that are on the horizon. So I would think that I think it's correct on the part of the Palestinian leadership and countries like Cuba, Venezuela, other countries to insist on the question of the two-state solution and make up and just fight like hell to avoid complete annexation, because that would be a much, much, much worse situation where it would have definitely exposed Israel, no question about it. There's been an interesting debate on what type of society Israel is. For quite a long time, many people who supported Palestine compared the Zionist colonization with either the Turkish or British colonization or colonizations in another part of the world. And we had said, no, that's not a correct analogy. We had what we called the idea of colonial settler state. That is, it's true that the Portuguese had colony in Angola and Mozambique, or even the French in Algeria, which had more than 1 million people. But basically, these were people from Portugal or France living in other countries. And when colony ended, they went back to France and Portugal, etc. What has happened in Palestine and in South Africa is a colonial settler state. That is, you have a new population that has arisen in these states, not just being a colony, but also a birth of a nation with an oppressive relationship toward the majority of the population. And it's a colonial settler state. It's colonial, as was Angola, Vietnam, many countries that were under European colonialism. but it is also it's a different type of category because undoubtedly there is an Israeli nation, undoubtedly there is an American nation. There are a lot of other colonial enterprises. In the case of the US, New Zealand, and Australia, the indigenous populations practically wiped out. So it did not have the ramifications as in South Africa, where you had a majority Black population, vast majority, and in Israel, Palestine, where it's about 50%, 50%. But there has to be a fight to the finish against any sort of racist, ethnic definition of the state. I think that is absolutely fundamental, irregardless day-to-day battles that might take place on specific questions.
I see we have a question from Norma Harrison.
Hi, Cliff and everybody. I have a number of comments. Not everybody has access to the chat in which I've written my usual brilliant commentaries. One of them is the Jews who were made to go to occupy Palestine in 1948 were under the thumb of conspirators, other Jews who wanted to control a land like conquering kings before them. And of course, UK, the United, whatever that thing is, always the conqueror. Not all the new occupiers had chosen that. Many wanted the US, which said no, and the USSR, which was more or less accepting, and you can correct me if I'm wrong about that. The displacement of that ravaged group of people desperately seeking aid was not their choice, that formation, the ruination, the horror committed upon the people that lived in Palestine. And one of my comments is what's necessary is the people, be able to enact the right of return, especially those people still carrying their keys. Jews, get out of my house. Build next door to me. I'll leave it there. And if you want the chat, my email is normaha@pacbell.net, NORMAHA at PACBELL.net, normaha@pacbell.net. I'll send you all these rich comments.